He married her out of guilt, never kissed her at the altar, never looked her in the eye. But years later, standing at the county fair, he dropped the hand of his stunning ex and crossed the dance floor to take his wife's instead, mud-streaked dress, wind-blown hair, and all. In front of everyone who had ever called her plain, he said 5 words she never thought she'd hear. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The morning sun cut through the chapel windows in long, slanted beams, illuminating dust motes that floated like forgotten memories. Caleb Harris stood ramrod straight in a starched shirt he hadn't picked out, in boots polished by someone else's hand, at the altar of a wedding he hadn't dreamed of. His eyes weren't on Clara Monroe. They were fixed somewhere just over her shoulder, as if staring down a storm only he could see. Clara stood beside him, hands clasped in front of her, a faded blue dress modest and slightly too big across her narrow shoulders. Her pale blonde hair had been brushed back in soft waves, pinned simply behind her ears. No veil, no bouquet. Just a woman carrying the kind of stillness that had nothing to do with nerves. It was the stillness of someone used to being unseen. The preacher's voice echoed gently in the near-empty church, quoting vows neither of them truly felt. Caleb's answers came in gruff monosyllables. "I do," more like a promise made to a ghost than to the woman beside him. Clara's voice, when she spoke, was almost a whisper, but it didn't waver. She knew what she was stepping into. She just didn't know how much it would hurt. When it was over, Caleb didn't kiss her, didn't touch her arm. He simply nodded to the preacher, muttered a thank you to the 3 neighbors who had come, and walked her silently out the door. They rode home in separate silence. The ranch house, once his mother's pride, stood waiting with chipped shutters and a porch swing that creaked in the wind like an old woman sighing. Caleb opened the front door for her, but didn't look back. Clara stepped inside like a guest unsure of her welcome, her suitcase small, her presence smaller. Her footsteps barely made a sound on the hardwood. That night, they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, 2 mugs of coffee between them, growing cold. Caleb didn't ask about her day. Clara didn't ask where she should sleep. He pointed to the guest room. She nodded. No words, no touch, no warmth. Only the sound of a man fulfilling a promise to a dying mother, and a woman still holding out hope that kindness could one day turn into love. But hope, like dust in a sunbeam, is easy to miss when you're not looking. Clara Monroe woke each day before the sun, when the house was still asleep and the air felt like it hadn't yet decided what kind of day it would be. She padded barefoot across the cold floorboards, careful not to disturb the quiet. Even the old clock in the hallway seemed to tick more gently in her presence, as if conspiring with her not to intrude. She moved through the house like she didn't belong in it. Every drawer she opened, she closed softly. Every step she took, she measured. She learned the creak in the 3rd stair and the way the pantry door stuck when it rained. She adapted to the rhythm of a place that had never been made for her, not really. Caleb never complained. He never barked at her or criticized her work. But his silence had a shape, wide, cold, and impenetrable. He ate the meals she made without comment. He wore the shirts she mended without acknowledgement. And at night, when they lay side by side in a bed built for closeness, he curled toward the wall while she folded herself into stillness. Sometimes she wondered what would be worse, his anger or his indifference. Around town they called her the nurse, as if that role had swallowed everything else she'd ever been. When she went into the feed store or the post office, people smiled politely but with a glaze in their eyes. "He's lucky to have you," they said. "You've got such a gentle way." What they meant was, you're lucky he kept you. You're lucky to have a man like Caleb, but luck doesn't echo in empty rooms. Luck doesn't watch the man you married tip his hat to strangers with more warmth than he's ever given you. Clara tended the horses with care. She brushed their manes and whispered to them as if they were the only ones willing to see her. In the barn, she could breathe a little deeper. With animals, she didn't have to apologize for her presence. Once, she found a scarf of his tucked into the old trunk at the foot of the bed. She wore it while sweeping the porch, not because it was cold, but because it smelled faintly of him. When he passed by, he didn't say a word. Just looked once, then looked away. She folded it back into the trunk that night. A ghost doesn't keep souvenirs. She only leaves the house a little cleaner than she found it, and waits, wordless, for someone to see she's still there. The rain had tapped on the windows all morning like a visitor that wouldn't leave, steady and insistent. Clara moved through the house in her usual silence, wiping down windows, setting bread to rise, checking the slow leak beneath the kitchen sink. The rhythm of domesticity kept her grounded. It was something to hold on to, something that didn't shift or disappoint. She hadn't meant to open the drawer. Caleb's old roll-top desk wasn't locked, but it was his all the same. His pens, his yellowed ledgers, the dust-thick papers he never seemed to sort through. She was only looking for a stamp. That was the truth. But the envelope sat there like it was waiting for her. Cream-colored, unsealed, edges worn like it had been read more than once. Clara's fingers trembled, but she didn't stop herself. The handwriting was elegant, slanted, feminine, the kind that comes from women who've never had to scrub dishes until their knuckles bleed. Meredith. That name had drifted through conversations like a shadow. Caleb never spoke of her, but the town did. Beautiful, cultured, left for the city and never looked back. The letter was dated months ago, before the wedding. You always give too much to women who need saving. Pity isn't love, Caleb. It's self-punishment. Clara read it twice. Not out of shock, not even hurt, just to be sure she hadn't imagined it. She folded the letter with careful hands and placed it exactly where it had been. Then she stood for a long while in the quiet room, listening to the tick of the wall clock and the rain turning gravel into mud outside. She didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because tears would have made it too small, too soft. What she felt wasn't soft. It was bone deep and sharp-edged, a breaking, yes, but not of her spirit. The words had cut something loose, something heavy she'd been dragging since the day she said, "I do," to a man who didn't see her. Clara had once mistaken patience for strength. But now, standing in that still room, she saw it differently. She saw how she'd made herself small enough to fit into someone else's life, and how that life hadn't grown to fit her back. She didn't burn the letter. She didn't confront Caleb. She simply decided. She would no longer hope to be seen. She would no longer wait for permission to matter. From that moment forward, she wouldn't ask to belong. She would become unforgettable. The sky turned to copper before noon. Smoke crawled over the ridge behind Mill Hollow, low and slow at first, then rising like a threat made flesh. Most folks had seen wildfires from afar, dust columns over the hills. But this one came hungry, wind-whipped and fast, and it was headed straight for the old Monroe property. 70 acres of pine, bone-dry fields, and an abandoned barn full of memories. Clara didn't hesitate. She heard the first warning from a local AM broadcast and was already saddling Bluebell before the second alert cut in. No one told her to. No one expected her to. But the land had once been her father's. The barn had once held her childhood horse, her brother's laughter, her mother's voice calling them in from dusk. It wasn't just timber. It was bloodline. She rode into smoke thicker than dusk, coughing through the bandana she'd tied over her nose, a sloshing pail gripped in one hand, a shovel strapped to the saddle. By the time Caleb heard the knock on the door, just a neighbor shouting her name with panic in his voice, she was already knee-deep in soot, shouting at flames and swatting sparks off the barn's roof with a wet feed sack. She worked like a soldier. No panic, no theatrics. A boy, maybe 9 or 10, clung to the rafters inside, eyes wide, lips trembling. She'd seen his mother run off the property earlier, trying to get help. Clara coaxed him down with a tone that made no room for fear. Then she carried him, coughing and limp, through the smoke, wrapped in her coat like he was her own. When Caleb finally arrived, his boots skidding in scorched dirt, shirt soaked with sweat and lungs burning with every breath, he froze. There she stood, silhouetted against the smoldering barn, ash streaked across her cheeks like war paint, the child safe at her side, the horses corralled, the fire beaten back by her bare will and borrowed tools. She looked at him, not with defiance, not with pride, but with clarity. "I'm not just the woman who made your mama comfortable," she said, voice hoarse but steady. "I've lived fire before." Caleb opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came. Because in that moment, the woman he'd married out of duty stood taller than any man he'd ever known. And for the first time, he really saw her. The wind had calmed by dawn, but the land still bore the bruises of the storm. Branches littered the gravel drive like bones, and Caleb's boots sank into soaked earth with each step. The north pasture came into view with a gut-deep sense of dread. He'd seen what straight-line winds could do, twist a century-old oak like straw, peel fence posts from the ground like weeds. But what stopped him wasn't the wreckage. It was Clara. She stood alone at the far edge of the field, one hand steadying a warped fence rail, the other swinging a hammer with rhythmic force. Her clothes clung to her like a second skin, jeans dark with rain and muck, her flannel shirt stained and rolled to the elbows. Blisters peeked through ripped gardening gloves. A streak of mud ran down her cheek like war paint. She didn't flinch, didn't pause. Each nail driven into the wood felt like punctuation at the end of a sentence no one else had dared to say. Caleb slowed his approach, uncertain. He was supposed to be the one who fixed fences, who brought strength into the space she quietly kept. "You didn't wait for help?" he asked, voice low, more surprise than criticism. Clara turned toward him without missing a beat. Her chest rose and fell with effort, but her gaze was unshaken. "I'm not someone who waits," she said. The words weren't defensive. They weren't proud. They just were. She turned back, gave one final strike to the nailhead, then tossed the hammer into the bucket like it belonged there. The fence stood whole again, crooked in places, patched in others, but it stood. And then she walked right past him. Not brusquely, not with attitude, just with the unmistakable air of someone who had already made peace with what she was capable of and didn't need a witness to validate it. Caleb watched her go, water dripping from the brim of his hat, hands shoved uselessly in his coat pockets. He'd seen Clara every day for months, in the kitchen, at the barn, beside him in a bed divided by silence. But this woman, walking away with mud-caked boots and blistered palms? He didn't recognize her. Not as a duty, not as a debt. For the first time, he saw her as something else entirely. A force, and for the first time he wondered what kind of man it made him, not to have noticed sooner. The clatter of silverware and the rise and fall of polite chatter filled the Harris dining room, but beneath the hum ran a current, sharp, silent, and cutting. Caleb's sister, Denise, sat at the head of the table like she still owned the house, her diamond-studded nails tapping against her wine glass with unconscious rhythm. Her husband laughed too loudly at his own stories, and their twin boys stared at their phones. barely touching the roast Clara had carved with care. Clara moved between the table and the kitchen with a quiet precision. She wore a pale blue dress, clean but modest, and her hair was pinned up simply, just the way Caleb's mother had liked it. She never interrupted, never inserted herself into the conversation, and yet the room seemed to pivot around her. She served without flourish, refilled without fuss. But she wasn't invisible. She was undeniable. Still, the comments came, coated in sugar and spite. "She's very attentive," Denise said, lifting her eyebrows across the table to Caleb. Her tone dipped in something that sounded like concern but stung like condescension. "Sweet, too. Just not what I expected, I guess. I mean, she's not exactly wife material." The words, murmured behind a half-raised wine glass, weren't meant to carry. But they did. Caleb looked up from his plate, his jaw tight. Clara didn't flinch. She simply straightened her spine and offered a smile that was as unreadable as it was composed. Then she disappeared into the kitchen one last time. When she returned, she carried a cast-iron skillet wrapped in a faded linen towel, the kind their mother had always used. The smell hit first. Warm, nostalgic, unmistakable. Cornbread. But not just any cornbread. Their mother's cornbread. The recipe no one had ever managed to replicate. The one Denise had begged for, year after year, and claimed was lost forever. Clara placed it gently on the table and began slicing. Denise stared. "How did you—" "She taught me," Clara said simply, looking her dead in the eye. "When you were too busy to visit." The boys looked up from their screens. Denise went pale. Her husband cleared his throat. Even Caleb lowered his fork. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was reverent. Clara didn't sit at the table like someone seeking approval. She sat like someone who'd earned the right to be there, and had simply waited for everyone else to catch up. The tavern light flickered in the distance, a soft glow across the hills beyond the Harris Ranch, steady, familiar, and for the first time in years, uninviting. Caleb stood at the edge of the porch for a long while, boots planted, arms folded across his chest. The wind had begun to shift, brushing cold across the open fields, hinting at the season's turn. And yet, it wasn't the chill that kept him rooted. It was something quieter, something less definable, rising like steam off a memory he hadn't meant to stir. Inside the house, a single lamp glowed in the kitchen. No music, no conversation. Just the rhythmic pull of thread through fabric, soft and steady. He stepped through the doorway without announcing himself. Clara sat at the table, her hair loose for once, falling in quiet waves over her shoulders. A thin beam of lamplight framed her face, casting delicate shadows across her cheekbones. She didn't see him at first, too focused on her task, mending the frayed cuff of his old canvas jacket. The one he hadn't worn since last winter, the one his mother had bought him before her final Christmas. Her fingers moved with precision, small, practiced stitches, not rushed, not for show. She didn't do things halfway, not anything. When she finally looked up and saw him in the doorway, her expression didn't change. No surprise, no softness, just quiet awareness. "Cold out?" she asked, her voice low and even. He meant to answer. He didn't. Instead, he walked to the chair across from her and sat, letting the silence fall between them like a heavy quilt. For a few seconds, all he heard was the scrape of thread through fabric and the clock ticking above the sink. "It's warmer here," he said, more to the moment than to her. Clara paused, not startled, just stilled, and met his eyes. There was no triumph in her gaze, no satisfaction, just the patient presence of someone who had been there all along, waiting without expectation. She handed him the finished jacket. Their fingers brushed. Caleb didn't move. He didn't need a drink. He didn't need noise or distraction. What he needed was this quiet, this fireless warmth, this place where the patching of an old coat felt like something sacred. He stayed, and for the first time, home felt less like a promise he had broken, and more like a promise he was ready to keep. The county fair buzzed with warm lights and restless motion, cotton candy spinning in machines, children laughing near the hay bales, and the low thrum of fiddle music rising above it all. Caleb Harris stood near the livestock tent, dust on his boots, reins in one hand, a vague scowl on his face born more of habit than mood. That's when Meredith appeared. She moved like memory, deliberate, shining, and polished with intent. Blonde hair curled at the ends, a cherry-red dress hugging her figure, and heels too fine for the gravel underfoot. She'd aged well, but her smile hadn't changed. It was still the kind that asked for something. "You still look good on a horse, Caleb," she said, tracing her fingers lightly along the sleeve of his flannel. The way her voice dipped, as if trying to stir an old ember back to flame. Caleb didn't step back, but he didn't answer either. A few feet away, Clara stood by the corn dog stand, a woven basket in one hand, watching. She wasn't dressed to dazzle. Denim skirt, simple blouse, boots scuffed from work. But there was a grace in her stillness, the kind that doesn't ask to be noticed. And yet, she saw everything. She didn't flinch, didn't fold, just turned quietly, basket at her side, and began to walk away. But Caleb saw her go. And this time, he moved. "Clara!" he called, loud enough to stop her. His voice cut through the fiddle and laughter like a chord out of key. She turned, eyes steady, unsure. Then he did something no one expected. He walked to her, right past Meredith, past the gossiping crowd, and held out his hand, palm up, fingers trembling slightly like a man not used to asking. "Dance with me," he said. Clara's brows pulled together. "Caleb, you don't—" "I know I didn't marry you for love," he said, voice low, honest. "But I see you now, and I'm asking. For me." The music swelled behind them, sweet and slow, and her breath caught, not because it was romantic, but because it was real. She took his hand. Their first dance wasn't perfect. He stepped on her foot once. She laughed. But the fair faded around them, and people stopped to watch not out of curiosity, but because something rare was happening. Pride giving way to humility, pity transforming into reverence. And for the first time, Clara didn't feel like a placeholder. She felt chosen. The night had settled soft around the ranch, thick with the scent of sagebrush and the faint smoke from the old ironwood stove inside. Crickets filled the silence between them, and a cool wind stirred the porch swing where they sat, apart, yet not distant. Clara's hands were folded in her lap, fingers knotted in that quiet way she had when something deeper stirred behind her calm. The moonlight cut across her cheek, softening the lines of sun and labor, revealing the face of a woman not made to dazzle, but to endure. She didn't look at him when she asked, "Would you have ever loved me if you hadn't had to marry me?" The words didn't sting. They rooted. Caleb's breath caught mid-exhale. He didn't shift, didn't deflect. He simply looked at her. Really looked. She was the same woman who had stood in wildfire smoke without blinking, who hammered fence posts without waiting, who endured his silence and the world's assumptions with a kind of strength that didn't need to be loud to be mighty. He realized he had never truly seen her until she stopped trying to be seen. "I don't know," he said at last, voice thick. "Not because you're unworthy, but because I was blind to the kind of love that doesn't demand attention." Clara turned then, slowly. Her eyes searched his, but she didn't speak. "You taught me what it looks like," Caleb continued, his gaze never leaving hers. Not the kind you find in letters or lace or flirtation. The kind that shows up again and again no matter how cold the room gets. The kind that fixes what's broken and stays even when the door's wide open. He rubbed his hands together, calloused fingers scraping. And I didn't deserve it. Any of it. I still don't. She blinked once. Still no words. But I want to earn it, he said, voice rough now. I want to spend every damn day trying to. Silence sat between them like a third presence. Not heavy this time, but reverent. Then Clara reached out, slowly. One hand resting over his, not with forgiveness, not with finality, but with quiet acceptance of the truth finally spoken. And for Caleb, that small gesture meant more than any vow he'd ever taken. Because this was the moment that made them real. The fire had burned low in the hearth, casting flickers of gold and ember red across the old ranch house walls. Caleb Harris, now silver-haired and slower in his movements, sat in the high-backed chair worn smooth by decades of long nights and hard winters. In his hands, creased at the corners and softened from being held too often, was a photograph. Not the one from their wedding. He rarely looked at that one. It felt like a lie now. That stiff moment in front of the preacher, two strangers in their Sunday best. It was the other photo that mattered. The one taken on a spring morning when no one was watching. Clara in her work shirt and muddy boots, hair wind-blown and eyes locked on the horizon. Behind her, the field she refused to let the fire take. Around her, nothing but sky and strength. Caleb's thumb traced the edges of the image, not to straighten it, just to feel closer. Folks had called her plain, some kinder, some less so. Weak, even in the early days. Not the kind of woman a man like you should marry, they'd say, as if love were something measured in looks or lineage. But those people never saw her rebuild fences with splinters in her hands, never watched her carry a child from a burning barn with smoke in her lungs, never tasted the cornbread she made by memory and grief from a recipe no one had cared to learn except her. They didn't see her steady him when he faltered, challenge him when he retreated, forgive him before he ever asked. He closed his eyes, the quiet in the room no longer empty, but full of her footsteps, her hum while sweeping the kitchen, her laugh that took time to bloom, but always did. She hadn't haunted this place after death. She'd become part of it. In the worn floorboards, in the weathered porch swing, in the scent of pine and lye soap, in the threads of the patched coat still hanging by the door. Clara was everywhere. Caleb placed the photo on the mantel, not beside the wedding portraits of others, but in the center, alone, undeniable. Because she hadn't just been his wife. She had been the truth that taught him how to love, the proof that real strength doesn't need to be loud to leave an echo. And in the stillness of a house once filled with silence, her presence still carried like a prayer.